Well, welcome back to our read through the Bible, and we are in the Exodus stage, and today we're picking up in Leviticus chapter 11. But before we go forward with the text that we have today, let's just do a little bit of reviewing. Remember that the big theme of the book of Leviticus is what? Be ye holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. God is holy, and those that approach him must be pure and holy also. So you remember how this works. As we came out of the book of Exodus, God has established a central place of worship, the Tabernacle. And as you go through the first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus, God describes a method of worship, a sacrificial system. All this is designed so that the Israelites can be pure and holy and worship God in the right way. And then in verses 8, 9, and 10, one family of priests is set apart, the Aaronic priesthood, so that priests can help in the worship of God. Well, then as you come into chapter 11 through chapter 15, you have purity laws, and these are ceremonial purity laws. In chapters 18 and following, you get what's called the moral laws. But this is very important because to worship God, we have to be holy. We have to keep his commandments. So let's pick up in chapter 11. Now, in chapter 11, it talks about clean and unclean animals. Now, of the land animals, this is kind of interesting. If it splits the hoof and it chews the cud, then it's basically clean, And so you have these things that are sometimes you'll have an animal that has a split hoof like a pig, but it doesn't chew the cud, so it's not clean. A camel's not clean, rabbits aren't clean. And you'll go through this process of the fish. It was kind of pretty easy that if it had scales and fins, it was clean. If it wasn't, it was not clean. In other words, a catfish may have fins but doesn't have scales, so it is considered unclean. And these were things the Israelites were not to eat. They were to avoid these and don't touch their carcasses. And then of the birds of the air, it kind of names them one by one. For example, birds of prey, falcons, eagles, hawks, stuff like that. This is unclean. Gulls are unclean. Storks are unclean. Virtually all insects are unclean with the exception of those of the grasshopper family. Crickets and stuff, would be considered clean. Locusts of various types, they would be considered clean, and you could eat them. And then all the reptiles are considered unclean. And so in chapter 11, it talks about this, and this may seem strange, but again, these are ceremonial laws, and what we're talking about is the purity of God. And so if someone becomes unclean, they have to go through this process of becoming clean again. Sometimes it was just a matter of washing your clothes and waiting until evening if you touch something. But at any rate, God is holy, and he has to be treated as holy, so he establishes these laws. Then in chapter 12, it goes on to talk about something quite interesting, and that is the uncleanness associated with childbirth. For example, when a boy was born, the mother was to be considered unclean for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, the young man was to be circumcised. And there were 33 more days of purification. You couldn't go in the sanctuary. It's interesting, if the baby was a girl, the uncleanliness lasted 14 days, and the days of purification lasted 80 days. And so after the time of the purification, the mother would then present to the priest and at the tent of meeting, bring a lamb for a burnt offering, a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Now, if you were really poor, and this was the case of Jesus, you can look over in Luke chapter 2, 22 through 24, and you'll see this. When Mary and Joseph come, they present what? Not a lamb and a turtle dove, but 2 turtle doves, one for the burnt offering and one for the sin offering. This was income sensitive, so clearly Mary and Joseph were very poor. Sometimes you might say, well, why this? And the answer is we really don't know, except that, again, these are the ceremonial laws of how we approach God. Some will say, well, it's because we're all born in sin. Some will say it was kind of a practical reality for the protection of the mother during this kind of very sensitive time, perhaps both of those. Now, if it's kind of been interesting here, it's going to get kind of really interesting now, because chapter 13 talks about how the priest would check for skin diseases. And this is the diagnosis of leprosy. And that covered a lot of ground, actually, in the Old Testament. But the priest would inspect leprosy. And I'm not going to go into every detail here in chapter 13, but he would examine and see if someone was diseased. If it wasn't sure, a lot of times they would quarantine a person for 7 days, come back and recheck. And if it was indeed cleansed, then you'd go through a process. If not, then that person would become unclean. There was given ways to examine boils, burns, infections in the beard, the face, all of this. And a lot of times, again, you would have to quarantine for a period of 7 days and then come back. Now, if a person were judged to be, by the priest, a true leopard, they would wear torn clothes, the head is bare, they would cover their upper lip, and they would cry, unclean and clean, and they had to go outside of the camp. They could not be associated with God's people and the nation of Israel. Now, chapter 14 is interesting, again, because it deals with how a leper is cleansed. And this is interesting because the priest would go outside the camp and he would examine the person. And if the person were clean, if they were healed of leprosy, there was a very interesting ritual in which he would take 2 live clean birds, the priest would, some cedar wood, a scarlet string, and a hyssop. And he would go through this process of sacrifice the one bird, release the other bird, and it kind of represented this whole concept of death and resurrection, which you see in Jesus Christ later on. But the cedar wood, cedar was such a great big tree, and the hyssop so small, kind of represents the fact that God condescends to meet our needs. And the scarlet string, of course, represented the blood of Jesus Christ. So all of this is symbolic of the coming of Jesus Christ. And the person is restored, and they're brought back into the camp. Now, it's also interesting that in chapter 14, verses 33 through 53, the priest would even inspect the houses if there were mold, mildew, fungus, and there was a method for all of that. And then chapter 15, it goes on to talk about bodily discharge. In other words, if someone had a disease of the sexual organs, the male sexual organs, there was a way of dealing with this. And when the person became clean, they would offer sacrifices unto God, and they would be proclaimed clean again. Now, just a man having relations with his wife, there, of course, was no sacrifice that was necessary. You just wait until that night is over, bathe, wash, and then you would be considered clean again. A woman in a menstrual period was unclean 7 days. No special offering was needed. Now, if a woman had female issues that were much deeper than that, then there was a cleansing process. And you might say, well, this doesn't seem like, why all this? Well, again, this is ceremonial. It's not necessarily sinful in the sense that we think of this, but when you come before God, God is holy. So kind of think of all of this. You have the place of worship, the tabernacle, the method of worship, a sacrificial system, the priest, the people that are guiding the worship, and then you have these laws because God is going to be treated as holy. And then we come to the most important part of the book, and that is chapters 16 and 17, and this will finish up our time today. But chapter 16 presents us with the Day of Atonement. And this was one time a year. It was on the 7th of Tishri, 7/10, 7th month, 10th day. And this is a day that God called for the high priest to make atonement for the entire nation of Israel. So what happened on the Day of Atonement is that, first of all, the priest would come to the laver, take water, and wash himself. Then he would put on the high priestly clothes. Then he would offer a bull for himself and his family. This is important. He'd offer a bull for himself and his family. He would literally go inside the veil. And you had to do this the right way. You didn't dare do this in the wrong way or you would be struck dead. Went inside the veil, and he offered incense, and so the smoke would cover the mercy seat, and there he would sprinkle the blood of the bull for himself. Well, he would also then take a goat, offer a goat for the people, put the blood there also. And it's interesting, let me back up just a moment. On the goat that he offered, there were actually 2 goats that were chosen, and he would cast lots. the one that the lot fell on for the offering, like I said, he would kill that goat, offer it as a sin offering for the people. Now, the other goat, this is fascinating, was referred to as the scapegoat. Have you ever heard that term, the scapegoat? Well, here's where the whole concept of the scapegoat comes from. Okay, the priest, after making atonement for himself, the people, the holy place, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the altar, and all of that, through the sprinkling of the blood, everything is made holy here. Okay, they would take the live goat. The priest would put his hands on it. He would confess the sins of the people, and that goat would be released and symbolically carry the sins of the people away into the wilderness. Okay, so, and then the high priest would go into the tent of meeting, change clothes, bathe, offer burnt offerings, again for himself and the people, and this was to be a permanent statute, and it was very important because all of this is pointing to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Remember, the one goat that is killed, that's sacrificed, and then the sins of the people are carried away. But again, this was a perpetual statute, and it had to be repeated year after year. Very important day, so they obeyed him. And then in chapter 17, it talks about the fact that Israel had to have these sacrifices at the tent of meeting, at the tabernacle. Why? Because they were prone to wonder. They would worship demonic gods, false gods. In fact, it said here, be careful about sacrificing to the goat demons of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. In other words, you're going to worship only the true God. God knew that they would they would embrace idolatry, and they did. And that's the reason later on that the entire nation goes into the captivity of the Babylonian, the Assyrian captivity, judgment because of idolatry. Also in the last few verses of chapter 17, there's a severe warning against the misuse of blood. Now, we talked about this earlier, but blood, of course, is the life of the animal. Blood sacrifices point to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. But even when a hunter kills an animal, and we can certainly relate to this, he was to drain the blood out because pagan hunters would bless the god of the hunt, which the gods of the Gentiles, and Paul's writing the church at Corinth, we know are demonic powers. So they had to be careful in the way that they did this. So all sacrifice, again, is to be at the tent of meeting, at the tabernacle. So you have this system, okay, a place of worship, a method of worship, a person to guide the worship, and then the laws, the holiness. And the whole point, remember this, is to come before God, I have to be pure and holy. The holiness of God is reiterated over and over and over again. And all of this, of course, points to the fact the only one who can make us holy is who? Jesus Christ. Without holiness, we will never, ever see God. This book is driving into the minds of the Israelites, and it should into our minds too, that to be holy, we have, that to see God, we have to be holy. And the only one that can make us holy is Jesus. Read the Bible. God bless and have a great day.